The first thing Mara Voss noticed about the dead zone was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room or a sleeping house, but the silence of a place that had learned to hold its breath. The kind of silence that had teeth. She crouched at the perimeter barrier. A line of scorched yellow posts the Veth Corps had driven into the soil 3 years ago when they designated this entire valley off-limits to human movement, and studied the terrain beyond with the same methodical patience her father had taught her. He'd been a field ecologist before the arrival. He used to say you could read a landscape the way you read a face, if you were willing to be quiet long enough. She hadn't spoken to him in 4 months. The last transmission from his team had been a burst of static and 2 words in his voice. Still here. Then nothing. Behind her the team shifted in the low brush. "We're really doing this," said Declan, not a question. He was 26, former infrastructure engineer, currently the closest thing their resistance cell had to a mechanic. He had a habit of stating obvious things as if weighing them in his hands. "We really are," Mara said. The Veth Corps declared this a red corridor. Anything biological that crosses into a red corridor gets flagged by the orbital sensor net within 11 minutes. She'd already calculated it. "We move fast, stay low, use the ravine for the first 2 kilometers. The rock formations scatter the biosignatures. After that, we use the thermal suit panels." She patted the rolled fabric at her hip. "We'll have maybe 30 seconds of exposure in the open before we're back under canopy. And if the sensors are newer than the intelligence says they are, then we run." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Deck, I'm not asking anyone to come." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dead valley, the collapsed structures of what had been a research installation, the pale yellowed grass, the warped tree lines that bent wrong in directions the wind didn't account for, the way the whole place seemed to lean slightly away from the sky as if embarrassed by it. Then he shouldered his pack. "Your dad better be worth it," he said. The other 2, Priya their medic and old Joachim, who had done something classified for a government that no longer existed, exchanged a look and followed. They crossed the line at 0617. The Veth Corps had come 11 years ago. They hadn't announced themselves. There had been no radio signal, no message carved in crop circles, no dramatic entry through a tear in the sky. One morning there had simply been a shadow over the Atacama Desert the size of a small country, and by afternoon 3 more shadows had appeared over the Australian interior, the Siberian taiga, and the South China Sea. The shadows had descended slowly, the way something lowers itself into water it isn't sure of, with great care, and with the full expectation of displacing everything beneath it. The first year was still called the adjustment period by some of the older resistance members, which was a very polite way of describing the organized demolition of human military infrastructure, the systematic grounding of orbital assets, and the quiet, thorough establishment of what the Veth Corps called management zones. They didn't call themselves conquerors. Their broadcasts, delivered in perfect machine-translated English, Mandarin, Spanish, and 40 other languages within hours of arrival, described the process as ecological remediation. Humanity, they explained, had exceeded sustainable behavioral parameters. The Veth Corps were here to impose a corrective framework. Mara had been 14 when the shadows arrived. She remembered her father watching the news feed on his laptop at the kitchen table, his coffee going cold, his face doing something she'd never seen it do before. He'd looked at her and said, in the voice he used when he was being very precise, "Whatever happens next, Mara, pay attention. You can't navigate something you haven't studied." He'd spent the next 6 years studying the Veth Corps. He became one of the foremost human experts on their biology, their behavioral patterns, their communication methods, their hunting caste, the specialized sub-breed the Veth Corps deployed for enforcement purposes, the ones that moved on 6 limbs and communicated through subsonic pulse arrays, the ones that hunted in coordinated packs with a distributed intelligence that made them functionally impossible to fool with a single point of deception. They were called in the Resistance's field notes simply the runners, because that was what you did when you encountered them. You ran, and you usually didn't run fast enough. 3 years ago, Dr. Harlan Voss had filed his last official report with the Human Science Council before going dark. In it, he described a theoretical vulnerability in the runner's swarm mind architecture, a structural blind spot, a frequency of dissonance that, if introduced at the right moment and the right proximity, could fragment the distributed signal the pack used to coordinate. He'd called it Cognitive scatter. His models suggested that a pack of runners, properly scattered, would revert to individual behavioral modes, and individual runners, his data showed, were not the apex predators the pack was. They were actually somewhat less capable than a large Earth predator of comparable mass. The report had been classified within 24 hours. 2 weeks later, Harlan Voss's team had entered the area now designated as the Veth Corps' most restricted red corridor, the valley of what had been the Meridian Deep research installation, and had not come out. The Resistance had sat on his data for 2 years, arguing about its value, its risks, its accuracy. Mara had stopped arguing 4 months ago. She'd started planning instead. The ravine was deep and smelled of iron and old rain. The rock walls rose 6 meters on either side, close enough to feel claustrophobic, their surfaces scored with parallel lines that Mara was fairly certain were not geological. The Veth Corps used this valley. The marks were old, dating from the early adjustment period, but they were there if you knew how to look. Long, raking parallel furrows at roughly the height of a runner's mid-limb claw. Territorial markings, possibly, or something more functional. She photographed each one with a small camera clipped to her chest strap. Pay attention. Declan moved quietly for a big man. He had the engineer's habit of testing surfaces before committing weight to them, which in the ravine meant their footfalls were nearly silent on the loose shale. Priya kept her breathing controlled, and her eyes moving. Joachim simply walked the way he always walked, like a man who had made peace with every possible outcome, and was therefore afraid of none of them. He was 63 years old, and had once helped dismantle a rogue AI weapon system in a basement under Prague, though he never elaborated on the details. The Resistance had learned not to ask. At the 2-kilometer mark, Mara called a halt with a raised fist. The ravine ended here, opening into a broad, shallow depression that led toward the installation. Between the ravine mouth and the nearest intact structure was roughly 400 meters of open ground, pale scrub, broken concrete, the wreckage of what had been a vehicle of some kind, stripped to bare metal and rusted through. Open sky above. The orbital sensors would flag them the moment they stepped out. She unrolled the thermal suit panels, thin as fabric, reflective on one side, matte black on the other, and passed a section to each team member. They draped them over shoulders and heads like crude cloaks, matte side out. The panels wouldn't fool a dedicated scan, but they would scatter and delay a passive sweep, buying precious seconds. We move as one group. Don't bunch up. Keep 2 meters between each person. Stay in my footprints exactly. There's a drainage channel at 200 meters that'll give us partial cover. After that, full sprint to the first building. Questions? What's in the first building? Priya asked. According to the last survey imagery, the Northwestern Laboratory Block. My father's team was assigned to sublevel 2. She kept her voice flat and factual. Pay attention. Ready? They stepped into the open. Mara counted her steps and her heartbeat simultaneously, the way her father had once taught her to measure distance in the field when instruments weren't available. The sky above was that specific pale gray of early morning that made everything look two-dimensional, like a photograph of itself. The ruins ahead were still and silent. She could see the laboratory block clearly now, a 3-story concrete structure with its upper floor, collapsed inward, its facade cracked in long diagonal lines as though something very large had pressed against it from the outside. 100 meters, 200. The drainage channel, a shallow concrete trough, gave her 2 seconds of actual concealment. She used them to check her compass and reset her bearing. 300 meters. The open ground seemed to expand as she moved across it, the familiar perceptual trick of exposed terrain, the brain insisting the distance was growing rather than shrinking. She had counted to approximately 9 seconds of exposure when the quality of the silence changed. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was more like the absence of something that had been present a moment before. A subsonic pressure she hadn't consciously registered until it stopped. The ground carried it better than the air, a faint rhythmic pulse that had been ticking beneath her boots like a second heartbeat. It stopped. She ran. The team ran with her, no words required. Priya had felt it too, and Declan, and whatever Joachim felt he didn't show, but his legs were moving. They crossed the last 100 meters in full sprint and hit the shadow of the laboratory block's wall hard enough that Mara's shoulder bounced off the concrete. She pressed her back to the wall and scanned the open ground behind them. Nothing moved. For 30 full seconds, nothing moved. Declan was breathing hard. He pointed upward with one finger. The orbital sensor question. Mara shook her head. If the sensors had flagged them, the runners wouldn't come slowly and one at a time. They'd come all at once from 3 directions simultaneously, the standard flanking configurations her father's notes described. The fact that they were standing and breathing meant the thermal panels had worked. They had minutes, maybe more. She found the entrance to the building, a reinforced door that had been forced inward from outside, the metal frame bent in a shallow V by something that had pressed through it with extraordinary and casual force. Inside was dark. The floor was covered in 4 years of dust and debris, the ceiling partially caved, daylight admitted in thin beams through gaps above. The smell was mineral and stale and something else underneath, a faintly organic note, musky and sharp like the inside of a terrarium. Runner scent, Joachim said quietly. Old, Mara said, at least a week. She was reading the dust on the floor as her father would have read a landscape. The disturbance patterns were old. Nothing had moved here recently. How can you possibly know that? Declan asked. The dust has resettled over the track marks. See, here and here. She indicated with her boot. Fresh runner tracks in deep dust look like someone dug small trenches. These have fill drift. At least 7 days. She straightened. The stairwell should be at the far end of the corridor. Sub-level 2 was intact in a way the floors above were not. The Veth core had done something to the upper structure. Whether deliberate demolition or incidental damage from a runner impact was unclear. But underground the laboratories were dark and largely undisturbed, the kind of institutional stillness that suggested people had left quickly rather than never returned. Chairs pushed back from workstations, a mug with a dried ring at its bottom, a child's drawing taped to a partition wall. No, not a child's. The handwriting on it was an adult's, deliberately made simple. A round yellow sun, green hills, a stick figure standing in the middle of it with arms raised. Mara looked at it for 3 seconds and moved on. The personal effects locker in Laboratory 2C had Voss stenciled on it in black marker. It was locked. Mara used the bypass tool to open it in 40 seconds, a skill she'd acquired in the first year of the occupation when locked doors had abruptly become obstacles between living and not. Inside a spare field notebook, a battered multi-tool, a photograph of Mara at age 8, holding a frog with the expression of someone who has been handed a frog against their wishes, and, tucked in the notebook's back cover, a laminated data card. She held the card up in the thin light from her headlamp. It was a standard research facility backup media card, the kind used for sensitive data too important to risk on a networked system. On the adhesive label on its face, in her father's cramped handwriting, Cogscatter V3 full protocol. Her hands were steady. She was proud of them for that. Is that it? Priya asked softly. Version 3. He'd been working on a 3rd version. Mara turned it over, turned it back. The data we had was version 1. He refined it twice more. Declan exhaled through his nose. So we came here for the data upgrade. The original plan was just the data. Where's your? He stopped himself, which was uncharacteristic enough that Mara turned to look at him. His face had the expression of a man who has just remembered something important and deeply regretted the timing of the memory. Where's my father? She finished. Mara, he wouldn't leave this here as a posthumous drop. He'd know we'd come. He left this because he's still here and he wanted us to have it before. She put the card in her chest pocket, secured the button. We go deeper. The building plans only go to sub-level 2, Joachim said. My father's last transmission mentioned a sub-level 3 that doesn't appear in the official plans. The Veth core apparently don't demolish anything they find useful. They repurpose. She looked at the far wall of the laboratory, at the clean seam where the plaster met the floor. Too clean, seams accumulate grime. Clean seams meant the junction was newer than the surrounding material. Help me move this rack. Sub-level 3 was not in any human blueprint. The space below was larger than the floors above it, which was architecturally improbable, which meant the Veth core had extended it. The ceiling was higher than standard human construction, roughly 4 meters, with integrated lighting that emitted in spectrums the human eye found faintly wrong, slightly too far into the ultraviolet, making the white surfaces glow at the edges like something radioactive. The floor was smooth and pale, marked with the same parallel scoring Mara had seen in the ravine walls. The temperature was approximately 10 degrees cooler than outside. Along the walls, containment systems, clear-walled units each roughly 2 by 3 meters, each with ventilation grills and what appeared to be automated feeding mechanisms. Most were empty, 3 were not. In the second unit, pressed against the far wall with his knees drawn up and his eyes closed, Wearing the same field jacket he'd been wearing in the last photograph the council had on file was Dr. Harlan Voss. He was breathing. Mara crossed the room in something that was not quite running, her boots making no sound because she had forgotten about noise, and pressed her palm flat against the clear wall. Her father's eyes opened. They were the same dark brown they had always been. He blinked 3 times, slow and deliberate, the way a person orients themselves coming out of a deep sleep. And then his gaze found her face and he was on his feet before she could exhale. They couldn't embrace through the wall. She pressed both hands against it. He pressed both of his against hers, palm to palm, only the clear material between them, and said something she couldn't hear through the acoustic insulation. She read his lips. "You came." "Obviously," she said, loud enough that he heard something through the material. He was thinner. The jacket hung differently on him, but his eyes were sharp and they moved over her face the way an ecologist reads terrain, cataloging, noting, filing away. He was assessing her condition. She recognized the impulse because she was doing the same thing to him. She pulled back from the wall and pointed at the containment unit's locking mechanism. He shook his head and pointed at something behind her. She turned. The locking system was centralized. A panel on the opposite wall, currently showing a soft amber status light. Declan was already moving toward it. He studied it for 20 seconds, his lips moving. Then he turned back to Mara, with an expression she had learned to associate with technically solvable problems that were going to be irritating to solve. "It's core engineering, but the access logic is sequential rather than keyed. It's not biometric." He pulled tools from his bag. "I can do this. It'll take time." "How much time?" "Maybe 20. You have 10. She moved to the access panel at the room's far end, not the stairway they'd come down, but a second corridor that angled away into the dark. She needed to know the shape of the space she was in. Her father was trying to get her attention through the containment wall. She turned back. He mouthed something longer this time. She watched his lips carefully. "The 3rd unit." She looked at the 3rd occupied containment unit. It was at the far end of the room, partially obscured by a structural column. She walked toward it, her headlamp sweeping ahead. It was not her father's colleague or a second human prisoner. The runner was lying on its side in a configuration that suggested rest or sleep, though its 3 eyes were partially open, showing pale membranes. It was approximately 2.5 meters in length from articulated neck to tail tip, its 6 limbs folded compact against its body, its plated dorsal surface rising and falling with slow, even respiration. It was a juvenile. She could tell from the proportional size of the head relative to the body, and from the coloration. Adults darkened to a deep charcoal through the 3rd year. This one was still the pale bronze of early growth, which made the marking on its left foreshoulder unexpectedly visible. A series of geometric Veth core characters burned into the plate. Identification marks, the same kind of notation she'd seen on captive specimens in the Council's intelligence files. This runner had been caught, restrained, and apparently kept here. Her father was mouthing something again. She moved back to his unit, close enough to read him clearly. "They're studying us, studying them," he mouthed. Then, "The juvenile is part of the test. Do not release it." She looked back at the juvenile. It had shifted slightly, in a way that suggested it was not entirely asleep. "Do not release it." Her father pointed upward, then made a spreading gesture with his hands. Something coming from above, fanning outward. "They're coming." Mara looked at Declan. "Faster," she said. "I am going at the speed of correct," he replied, not looking up. Priya had moved to the stairwell entrance and was watching upward. Joachim had positioned himself at the secondary corridor entrance with the field lamp turned off, watching the dark. Neither of them said anything. The room held a silence that had structure to it now, the silence of people, managing fear with discipline. The subsonic pulse returned, stronger this time. The floor transmitted it clearly, a rhythmic double thud with a 2-second interval. Pack movement, multiple sources. The juvenile runner in the 3rd unit raised its head. Declan got the panel on the 8th minute. The amber light went green, and the containment unit on the left unsealed with a soft exhalation of pressurized air. Harlan Voss stepped out slowly, as a man steps out who has been sitting on a concrete floor for an indeterminate time and is not entirely certain his legs will support the weight of standing. Mara caught his arm. He steadied. He was looking at her with an expression that occupied the complex territory between relief and the particular guilt of a parent who has required their child to come rescue them. Later, she said. Yes. He nodded once. His voice was lower than she remembered and somewhat rough with disuse. Later. He reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket and produced a second data card. This one in a sealed evidence bag. This is version 4. I finished it down here. The Veth Corps were kind enough to provide extensive behavioral data. He paused, seemed to notice the irreverence of the observation, and pressed on. The cognitive scatter protocol has a delivery problem we need to discuss. The original version required proximity emission within 40 meters of the pack's primary signal node, which is the alpha runner, which means you have to get within 40 meters of an alpha runner to use it, which historically ends conversations. He took her arm, moving toward the stairwell. Version 4 has a modified resonance architecture, reflected scatter. You can trigger it remotely if you can create the right acoustic environment. What kind of acoustic environment? Confined space, hard surfaces, good reflectivity. He looked around at the sublevel, its pale Veth Corps walls, its 4-meter ceiling, its parallel scored floor. Something like this, actually. The pulse in the floor came again. The juvenile runner was now fully upright in its unit, pressing its faceplates against the clear wall, the 3 eyes fully open and rotating in their independent sockets, scanning the room with unmistakable recognition. It had felt the pack pulse, too. It was answering in some way Mara could not perceive, a low vibration in the unit walls, a frequency her ears couldn't quite catch, but her chest felt as a faint pressure. It's signaling, Joachim said. He was still at the secondary corridor entrance, very still. Something answered. The secondary corridor filled with sound. Not loud. The runners almost never made loud sounds during a hunt. Her father's notes had established that clearly. What it filled with was presence. The soft, dry percussion of 6-limbed movement on smooth flooring. The subtle shift in air pressure that preceded something large. The specific quality of light changing at the corridor's far end as bodies occluded it. They came around the bend in the corridor in a flowing, unhurried movement that managed to be both graceful and deeply alarming. 3 runners moving in a wedge formation, the outside 2 matching the pace and angle of the central one with a precision no individually motivated creature could maintain. Pack coordination, distributed thinking. The middle runner was larger than the juvenile, and larger than either flanker, its dorsal plates fully darkened to charcoal, a white scar line running from its shoulder to its mid-body, suggesting a previous encounter with something that had been allowed the distinction of leaving a mark. That was the alpha. Stairwells, Mara said. They moved. Harlan moved with them, faster than she'd expected given his condition. The body remembers threat even when the mind is still orienting. Priya hit the stairwell first and went up in a controlled sprint. Declan second, Harlan third, Mara turning at the stairwell entrance to see how much time they had. The alpha runner had stopped. It was standing at the entrance of the secondary corridor, the 2 flankers arranged behind it, and it was watching her. All 3 eyes, independent and rotating, converging to focus on her face. She'd read about this in her father's notes. The focusing behavior, rare in runner interactions with humans, typically indicating a subject under direct individual assessment rather than immediate predatory engagement. It was looking at her the way she looked at landscapes, cataloging, noting, filing away. She was in a stairwell entrance, and there were 3 runners 12 meters away, and she could not make herself move for approximately 2 seconds, because she was looking back, doing the same thing, and her father had taught her that you could not navigate something you hadn't studied. Then she was up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, Joachim's hand catching her elbow on a narrow turn and propelling her forward with the wordless efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing before. They came out of the laboratory building into full daylight, which had arrived fully during their time below. The pale gray had become a bright overcast that flattened shadows and made the open ground between the building and the ravine look very, very open. They'll come up through the building, Mara said, already moving. Or they'll go around. If they go around, they'll cut us off from the ravine, her father said. Yes, I've seen them do it 40 times in 4 months. They're faster than they look. How much faster? A healthy adult runner, open ground, can sustain approximately 60 kilometers per hour for short bursts. They won't run you down on instinct. They'll outflank you, form a containment perimeter, and then wait. His voice was still rough but very steady. Their containment is how they manage prey that doesn't behave predictably. If you can keep moving laterally relative to their perimeter, you prevent them from closing it. How long can they hold a perimeter? Indefinitely. The swarm mind doesn't tire the way individual cognition does, which is what the scatter protocol addresses. He touched his chest pocket. If I can get to a resonance space within range of the alpha, even indirect range, and trigger version 4, the pack loses its coherence. The alpha reverts to individual mode. The flankers lose synchronization. You have approximately 90 seconds before they re-establish signal. 90 seconds, in which a discoordinated runner is substantially less dangerous than a coordinated one, in which you could, theoretically, create enough lateral confusion to break out of the perimeter. He looked at her, theoretically. I like that word, she said. It's doing a lot of work in that sentence. Something moved in the building's upper window. A shadow, large, passing across the gap in the collapsed upper floor. Then another shadow, flanking. The runners had gone through the building and were assessing exits. They weren't rushing. The alpha, she realized, had followed them up the stairwell at a pace that was deliberately unhurried. They weren't fleeing prey. They were containing, orienting the perimeter, 400 meters to the ravine. She ran the geometry in her head. Runners at 60 kilometers per hour could cover 400 meters in approximately 24 seconds. Her team, running hard, could cover it in perhaps 70 seconds under optimal conditions. The delta was irrecoverable on port speed. The drainage channel, she said, midway across. Declan, when we hit it, I need 30 seconds from you. To do what? He stared at her. Then he said, I can do that in 20. Then do it in 20. She looked at her father. He was looking at the device in his hands, the data card, inadequate for its purpose now that the situation had moved past the data retrieval phase. He needed something that could generate and project the acoustic pattern. Declan's bag, she said. There's an emergency signal generator. Can you? He was already moving to Declan's pack, already pulling the device free, already doing something to it with the multi-tool from his own locker. His hands moved with the focused efficiency of someone doing something they have been thinking about for 4 months. His hands were steadier than hers. She was proud of him for that. They moved into the open. The landscape held them in its flat, overexposed attention. Behind her, the laboratory building disgorged shadows from 3 exits simultaneously. The main entrance, a ground-floor side window, and a gap in the collapsed east wall. 6 runners total. Not the 3 from below, a full pack, called up from holding positions outside the building, while the original 3 had moved underground to flush the prey. 6 runners. The alpha among them. She recognized the white scar, moving without hurry at the center of the emerging formation, its flankers already beginning the wide arc that would precede the perimeter close. Her father had been right. They were fast. The outer 2 runners had already curved 30 meters out to either side in the first 10 seconds, moving perpendicular to the direct line toward the ravine, a pincer that would close ahead of the team if they ran straight. Don't run straight, she said. Cut left 45 degrees. That takes us away from the ravine, Declan said. It makes them adjust the perimeter. That gives us 6 extra seconds. She was doing the math as she moved, the terrain reading that her father had spent her childhood teaching her, without either of them knowing it would be needed for this. Priya, when I say go, you angle right hard. Declan left. You, Joachim, straight line, full speed, don't look back. What are you doing? Priya asked, making the alpha pay attention to me. Why would you want? Because when it's paying attention to me, it isn't paying attention to the pattern. She glanced at her father. He was still working on the signal generator, walking at a half run without looking at his footing, which should have been dangerous and would have been for anyone who hadn't spent decades traversing difficult terrain while thinking about something. Else how long? 90 seconds. You have 40, he didn't look up. 60, 50, done when it's done, Mara. She nearly laughed. His voice, for a moment, was exactly as it had been when she was 12 years old and arguing about homework. The drainage channel appeared ahead. The 2 flanking runners had already curved far enough to be in her peripheral vision on both sides, maintaining distance, perfectly symmetric. This was the containment behavior her father had described. Not closing yet, just marking the edges, establishing the shape of the trap before springing it. Patient in the way that something with distributed cognition could be patient, because patience required no individual effort. The swarm mind simply held the shape and waited. 40 meters to the drainage channel. The alpha was directly behind them. She could feel its pulse in the ground now without concentrating for it. Stronger, individual. The specific signal of a pack leader in active coordination mode. Her father had described the alpha signal as the carrier frequency that the rest of the pack locked to. Remove the carrier and the locked frequencies drifted. The pack would still function individually, but it would lose the millisecond precise coordination that made them something other than large predators. 20 seconds, her father said. Declan, she started. On you, he said, the drainage channel. She hit the near edge and turned. The Alpha runner was 40 meters back precisely. She could see its 3 eyes, the scar line on its shoulder, the slight forward lean of its posture that her father's notes associated with the moment. Before a full pursuit commitment, it had been assessing her. Now it was reaching a conclusion. Now, she said to Declan. Declan had 4 compressed air evacuation charges from his engineering kit, ranged in a short line along the drainage channel's concrete floor. Noise and blast, no fragmentation, designed for clearing blocked shafts or signaling in collapse situations. He triggered them simultaneously. The concussion was not elegant. It was very loud, and it threw concrete dust and grit in a horizontal cone that reached all 4 runners on the near side of the formation simultaneously, the overpressure sufficient to cause immediate sensory disruption in the forward-facing acoustic organs. The 2 nearest flanking runners broke stride. The Alpha flinched. She saw it, the involuntary head turn away from the blast pressure, the momentary suspension of forward movement. Her father held the modified signal generator at arm's length and pressed the primary trigger. The sound it produced was below the threshold of human hearing. She felt it more than heard it, a low, bone-deep resonance that seemed to come from the ground itself, from the concrete walls of the drainage channel that were reflecting it, from the space between her teeth and the air in her chest cavity. The Veth Core sublevel had been the test environment. This was less ideal, but her father had built intolerances. For 3 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the outer right runner stopped moving. It was subtle at first, a hesitation, a half-step that didn't complete. A slight incoordination in the left front limb's placement relative to the right. Then the left outer runner did the same thing. Then one of the 2 mid-formation runners turned its head 90 degrees away from the team, looking at a point on the horizon that contained nothing of tactical significance, tracking something only its own now unsynchronized cognition presented to it. The Alpha stood very still. It was reasserting the carrier signal. She could almost feel it trying to. A pressure in the air, a quality of intense focus radiating from the scarred form 40 meters away, 3 eyes locked on the signal generator in her father's hand, with the recognition of something that understands precisely what is happening to it. 90 seconds, her father said. Go. She ran. They all ran. The Alpha stood motionless behind them, deep in the work of re-establishing coherence, and the 5 runners without a carrier signal moved in 5 individual directions that converged on nothing coordinated. One of the flanking runners took 3 steps toward the team and then turned away as if following an instruction that turned out to be wrong. Another actually sat, folding its front limbs beneath it in a configuration that would have been almost contemplative if it had been a different kind of animal. 400 meters. Subtract the distance they'd already covered crossing to the channel. 230 meters to the ravine. They were going to make it. Priya reached the ravine edge first and went over without breaking stride, dropping to the first ledge in a controlled fall. Joachim next, methodical as ever. Declan, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move, his pack swinging wide. Her father, she watched him reach the ravine edge and stop briefly and look back. She knew why. She had the same impulse. She killed it and grabbed his arm and pulled him over the edge with her, and they half fell down the first 3 meters together, catching on a rock shelf that abraded both their palms, and then they were in the ravine and moving, and the light above was full, morning. Silence of the dead valley was behind them. They cleared the perimeter markers at 10:44. Mara sat on the dry ground outside the dead zone's boundary and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. Her palms were bleeding from the rock shelf. Her legs had the specific exhausted quality of having demanded more of them than they technically had to give. She was aware of all of this without much caring about any of it. Her father sat beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Version 4, he said. The resonance delivery system is different. The acoustic approach I used just now was improvised. The protocol calls for a purpose-built emitter, something with enough focused projection to work at range without requiring a reflective environment. He paused. The council will want to manufacture it. The council will argue about it for 6 months first, she said. Yes. A very small sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, they probably will. She lowered her hands and looked at him. He looked like someone who had been inside a Vethcore containment unit for 4 months. Older than she remembered, sharper in some ways and dimmer in others, the professional precision still intact, the careful factual manner still intact, but the familiar solidity of him somehow more visible, as if the time underground had worn away whatever surface was usually between them. "You could have transmitted the data," she said, "the card. You had a way to get a signal out." "I know you did. The transmission 4 months ago proved the capability existed. The signal would have taken 2 seconds, long enough for the Vethcore monitoring systems to triangulate and destroy the receiving end." He folded his hands. "I couldn't risk whoever received it. So you stayed. So I stayed." He looked at the data cards in his jacket pocket. "Also, version 3 had errors. I needed the time." She stared at him. "That is," she said carefully, "the most thing you have ever said." He looked at her sidelong. "Are you saying I prioritize the science?" "I'm saying you prioritize the science. I would say I balance multiple factors. You absolutely did not." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific deliberateness of a man saying something he has been composing for a considerable time, "I also trusted that you would come." She looked away. The dead zone's perimeter markers stood in a line, yellow against the pale grass. The same scorched posts the Vethcore had driven in 3 years ago when they designated the valley off-limits. She had crossed them this morning. She would cross them again, when the time came, with better tools and larger numbers and the full benefit of a version 4 protocol that could scatter a pack's distributed intelligence like stones scattered from an open hand. The Vethcore had designated this valley off-limits because there was something in it they wanted to protect. The research, the data, the understanding they had accumulated about humanity and about themselves. They had designated it off-limits because they knew, better than most of their hierarchy probably admitted, what would happen if the prey being studied figured out how the study was designed. The prey had figured it out. "We should move," Joachim said. He was standing a few meters away with the same removed composure he'd maintained. Throughout, though his jacket was torn at the sleeve in a way it hadn't been before, and there was a scrape along his jawline that he hadn't noticed or was ignoring. "The Vethcore will reorient the sector patrol schedule when they realize the prisoners are gone. We have maybe 3 hours before the routes change." Mara stood. She felt the protest in her legs and ignored it. She helped her father up, and he let her, which told her more about his condition than anything he'd said. 3 hours, she said. "That's enough." 2 weeks later, Mara sat across a salvaged table from the 7 members of the Human Resistance Council and delivered the report in the tone her father had taught her, factual, precise, sequenced correctly. No emotional editorializing that would cloud the technical substance. The Cognitive Scatter Protocol, version 4, delivered acoustically, tested under live conditions against a full pack of 6 runners including an alpha in an improvised reflective environment. Documented outcome: complete pack decoordination lasting between 87 and 94 seconds by her. Field stopwatch. Individual runner behavior during scatter disoriented, non-aggressive, non-coordinated. Recoherence time estimated at 90 to 120 seconds based on observation of pack behavior as they retreated. The council listened. Some of them took notes. Some of them looked at each other the way people do when something they have been arguing about in theory has abruptly become a thing that happened. When she finished, the eldest council member, a retired infrastructure engineer named Sokolov, who had survived the first year of the adjustment period by accident, and every subsequent year by competence, leaned forward and said, "You're proposing we manufacture emitter units. My father's notes specify the technical requirements. Declan Marsh has reviewed them and says the components are available through existing supply lines." She put the data card on the table. Version 4, complete protocol. Sokolov looked at the data card. He looked at Mara. He had the face of a man calculating risk with the tools of long experience, which was a very good face to have in his position, and she respected it. "And you believe this works," he said. "I watched 3 adult runners sit down in the middle of a pursuit," she said. "One of them turned around and walked away from us." She paused. "I believe this works." Sokolov looked at the other council members. Something passed between them that was not quite agreement and not quite relief, but occupied the space where both of those things live. He picked up the data card. "We'll need time to manufacture," he said. 6 weeks, she said. "I've already drawn up a production schedule." He looked at her over the card. "You drew up a production schedule before this meeting." "I drew it up on the walk back from the dead zone." She met his eyes. "We've been waiting a long time. I'd prefer we stop waiting." The manufacturing took 8 weeks, not 6. Supply chain problems, material shortages, 2 workshop locations that had to be abandoned when VethCorps patrol routes shifted. Mara spent the time usefully. She trained teams on deployment protocols, working from her father's notes and her own direct observation. She studied the data from the juvenile runner her father had been held alongside. The containment records the VethCorps had left inaccessible. Systems, behavioral logs, the physiological measurements that the VethCorps' own instruments had recorded. She learned things. The VethCorps had come to Earth, as their official communications stated, as ecological remediators. They had a genuine, deeply held philosophical framework around this. A complex bioethical system built on the premise that any species demonstrating sustained environmental destructiveness was a systemic risk that their civilization had both the right and the obligation to constrain. They had done this, their records showed, on 4 other worlds in the previous 800 years. On 2 of those worlds, the constrained species had eventually complied with the framework. They still existed. They lived in designated management zones, their populations controlled, their territorial range defined by yellow boundary posts. They were documented in VethCorps scientific literature as successful interventions. On 1 world, the constrained species had gone extinct within 30 years of the intervention. The VethCorps records described this as an outcome to be avoided, with what read as genuine regret. On the 4th world, the constrained species had found a way to disrupt the hunting caste's coordination, architecture. Mara read that record 3 times. The 4th world species was not documented in the VethCorps successful outcomes literature. It was documented in what her father, reading the same records from sub-level 3, had labeled the Threat Assessment Archives. The 4th world species had survived, more than survived. The VethCorps had eventually withdrawn from that world after a period of conflict. Records described with bureaucratic restraint as operationally unsustainable. The 4th world species records were labeled with a VethCorps classification term that her father's translation matrix rendered as approximately those who did not remain prey. She closed the file and looked out the salvaged window of the workshop at the sky, which was the same sky it had always been, unchanged by the shadows that occasionally crossed it. The same sky her father had shown her constellations in when she was 6 years old, pointing out the names, the distances, the way light from some of those stars had left its source before humans existed. "Big sky," he had said, "lots of room in it." The first field deployment of the version 4 protocol happened in the Northern Management Zone on a Tuesday, in a rain that turned the rock slopes slick and the air into a gray curtain that reduced visibility to 30 meters. Mara led it. She had argued with herself about this during the 8 weeks of manufacturing. The argument against was obvious. She was one of 3 people who had directly experienced the scatter protocol under live conditions, which made her operationally valuable and therefore operationally irreplaceable, which was a reason to hold back. The argument for was equally obvious. She was one of 3 people who had directly experienced the scatter protocol under live conditions, which meant she knew something no training document could fully convey about the specific moment when the Alpha's focus broke, the quality of the silence that preceded it, the heartbeat of stillness in which everything became possible. She led it. The team was 14 people. They had 6 emitters, purpose-built, properly resonant, projection-focused, and enough documentation of runner behavioral patterns to run. Contingency protocols for 4 different terrain types. They had also, and Mara had insisted on this, 7 engineers, medics, and former scientists who had spent the previous 8 weeks studying exactly what the runners were and were not capable of, because you could not navigate something you hadn't studied. The Northern Zone held a VethCorps field installation, a mid-tier monitoring hub that controlled the sensor net for approximately 400 square kilometers of management zone perimeter. Disabling it would blind that section of perimeter for between 12 and 18 hours. The strategic value was obvious. The obstacle was the runner pack assigned to the installation's security. 8 adults, 2 alphas in a co-dominant arrangement that her father's research suggested was a known but relatively rare pack structure, and one that had not been tested with the scatter protocol. 2 alphas, 2 carrier signals. The protocol was designed to fragment 1 carrier. 2 carriers might compensate for each other during the scatter window, shortening the decoordination period. Mara had thought about this for 6 weeks. 2 emitters on simultaneous trigger, she told the team in the final briefing, the rain loud on the corrugated roof. Aimed at the 2 alphas simultaneously, with a half-second offset to prevent the second alpha from resynchronizing before the first scatter completes. She looked at their faces. They were wet and tired and had the specific alertness of people who have decided, clearly and finally, what they are willing to do. The offset timing requires coordination between the 2 trigger operators. That's Yusuf and Kira. You've practiced this 300 times. You know the drill better than I do at this point. Yusuf, who was 19 and had the steadiest hands Mara had ever seen, nodded once. Kira, who was 41 and had been a sound engineer before the arrival, and who had understood the acoustic principles of the protocol faster than anyone in the workshop, said, "We're ready. Then we're going." The installation was built into a hillside. The Veth Corps preferred elevated positions for monitoring hubs, consistent with a species that had originally evolved in open savanna environments and retained topographic preference for high ground. The approach required crossing a narrow ridgeline exposed on both sides, which in the rain and the gray light was genuinely unpleasant. Mara had planned a route that used a series of rock outcroppings as concealment breaks, reducing the open exposure segments to under 15 meters each. Individually manageable, as a coordinated group of 14, requiring timing and communication. They managed it without a runner contact until the final ridgeline. The contact came from below and to the right. 2 runners emerging from a fold in the terrain that the survey imagery had not shown clearly, moving uphill with the efficient 6-limbed gait that covered ground deceptively fast. The rest of the team froze in position at the ridgeline, as briefed. Mara signaled Declan, who was running comms on this deployment, and received the confirmation pulse that told her the rest of the pack was still at the installation undisturbed. 2 runners, a patrol pair, not connected to the installation's alpha pack in the immediate tactical sense. Subordinate animals doing a perimeter sweep, connected to the pack signal but at reduced priority. Standard protocol said, avoid and wait. Mara made a different call. She stepped out from the rock outcropping and put herself in the patrol pair's line of sight. Both runners stopped. Both heads swung toward her, the independent eyes converging to focus. The focusing behavior, cataloging, assessing, she was counting the seconds. The patrol pair would signal the pack. The pack would respond by sending in the standard configuration, 2 of the 8 adults plus 1 alpha to investigate. That would reduce the installation guard to 6 adults and 1 alpha. When Yusuf and Kira triggered the scatter on the installation, 1 alpha was well within the tested parameters. The 1 alpha now in transit toward her position would be out of range for the scatter, but it would be individual mode, non-coordinated. And by that point she would have 12 people and 6 emitters between her and it. The 2 patrol runners began to move toward her. She let them take 4 steps, enough to fully commit the patrol signal to the pack, enough to lock in the response. And then she moved laterally, fast, dropping behind the nearest rock outcropping and angling uphill toward the rendezvous point. She heard the pack response in the quality of the ground vibration, a ripple of distributed signal, 3 simultaneous sources moving to intercept. Into her earpiece, Declan's voice. Installation count, 5 adults, 1 alpha. 2 alphas are, I know where the 2 alphas are, she said, executu. The scatter triggered. She heard nothing directly. The emitters operated below audible frequencies. But she felt the pulse of it in her chest as she ran, and 40 seconds later, when she crested the ridgeline and looked down toward the installation, she saw the 5 adult runners of the installation guard performing actions that were, collectively, the most disoriented thing she had ever witnessed an apex predator do. 1 was walking in a slow, purposeless circle. 2 had sat. 1 was pressing its faceplates against the installation wall in a behavior that might have been meaningful in a coordinated pack context and was, in individual mode, simply strange. 1 was looking directly at Mara's position on the ridgeline with what she anthropomorphically interpreted as confusion. The installation team moved in. She looked back downslope, tracking the 2 runners from the patrol. They were stationary. The alpha that had been moving to intercept had stopped 40 meters below the ridgeline and was making no further approach. Without the pack signal, its tactical certainty had evaporated. It knew where she was. It knew she was a threat. It did not know, in the absence of 11 other minds confirming the correct response, what to do about it. She watched it for 3 full seconds. 3 eyes watching her, the characteristic focusing behavior, cataloging, noting, in her earpiece, installation is ours, sensor hub is offline. She kept her eyes on the Alpha. It kept its eyes on her. Then it turned and moved downslope away from her, in the unhurried movement of something that has decided, for its own reasons, that this encounter is concluded. Not fleeing. The runners didn't flee, just withdrawing, making a decision she could not fully read. She watched it go over the following 3 months, 14 more deployments, 7 more sensor hubs offline, 2 Veth Core administrative nodes disrupted, 31 management zone perimeter sections with blind spots now documented in human resistance maps, 43 scatter protocol emitters manufactured and distributed to 12 regional cells. The council stopped arguing and started planning. Sokolov, in a meeting Mara attended more as a courtesy than a necessity, acknowledged what everyone in the room had understood for several months. This was not a containment action anymore. This was something with direction, something building towards something. Her father rejoined the science division with, as he put it, somewhat more data than he'd had when he left. He was thinner still, but the sharpness was back fully, and the roughness had left his voice. He gave a lecture to the gathered council and regional leaders on Veth Core cognitive architecture that ran 4 hours and generated approximately 900 pages of notes and the beginning of 6 new research programs. Afterward, Mara found him in the hallway outside the lecture room, leaning against the wall, looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has said a great many words in a concentrated period and needs a moment to be quiet. She stood next to him and leaned against the wall too. Version 5, he said eventually. Of course there's a version 5. The scatter duration can be extended. If you build the resonance into a sustained emitter rather than a pulse, a continuous broadcast, the pack can't re-establish coherence for as long as the broadcast continues. He looked at his hands. The power requirements are substantial, but if you put a sustained emitter at a fixed strategic position, a choke point, a known patrol route, we could hold a corridor, she said. Not just scatter a pack once. Hold a corridor against runner presence indefinitely. Theoretically, there's that word again. He smiled. It was a small smile, the specific smile of a man who has been right about something difficult for a long time and is finally in a position to act on it. She recognized it. She had the same smile. The Veth Core will adapt, he said. They always have. Their civilization has 800 years of experience with species that don't comply. They have strategies we haven't encountered yet. I know. The management zones won't simply collapse. The political structures they've imposed. I know, Dad. He looked at her. She looked at him. But, he said, she said. Outside the sky was the same sky, the same stars behind it, ancient and indifferent and very far away, light that had left its sources before any of this had happened, and would arrive somewhere long after. The Veth Core shadows were up there somewhere, vast and certain of their purpose. They had come to remediate an ecological problem. They had imposed their framework on a species they had assessed and found manageable. They had done this 4 times before. On 2 of those worlds, the assessment had held. On 1 of those worlds, it had not. The 4th world's file was in a Veth Core threat archive, labeled with a term that translated as those who did not remain prey. The Veth Core had eventually left that world. The records described the withdrawal as operationally unsustainable, but they did not. Mara had noted carefully, describe it as a failure. The Veth Core didn't frame it as a failure. She thought they should probably start. The scout team crossed the northern perimeter at 0300, 9 months after Mara had crossed the dead zone boundary, with Declan and Priya, and Joachim on a damp gray morning that felt very far away now. They were 20 people this time, not 4. Sustained emitters in a portable array that Declan's engineering team had built in 6 weeks flat, powered by a compact fuel cell that would run for 40 hours without refueling. She was carrying one of them herself. The scouts deployed in a fan formation, her father's recommendation, based on Veth Core patrol geometry. The night was clear and cold and very dark, and the stars were visible in their full unfiltered abundance, undimmed by the light pollution that had once softened them. One of the things the adjustment period had inadvertently done was give humanity back its stars. She was walking through grass that rose to her knees, damp with overnight dew, the emitter assembly cool against her back, the night cold and quiet in the way she had learned to read. Genuinely quiet this time, no subsonic pressure, no pulse in the ground, the sector sensors offline and the nearest known runner patrol 40 kilometers south, redirected by a decoy signal that Kira's acoustic team had built and planted the previous afternoon. The first sustained emitter was scheduled for installation at the northern ridgeline that overlooked what had been, Before the adjustment, a chain of mid-sized cities. 3 million people in management zones, their movement restricted, their sky full of Vethkor shadow. Below that ridgeline, when the emitter was online and the corridor established, there would be a path. Not a safe path, there was no such thing, and she had learned not to promise one, but a path without runners. A path where human movement could be human-paced and human-directed and not subject to the coordinated hunting logic of a swarm mind designed to keep prey inside its designated boundary. A path towards something. She stopped at the ridgeline and set down her pack and looked at the valley below. The lights of it scattered in the dark like something had dropped a handful of stars, and they'd fallen into the low places of the land and stayed there. Cities, people. 3 million people in management zones who had been told, in the careful machine-translated language of the Vethkor's ongoing broadcasts, that the framework was in place for their long-term benefit, that compliance was the rational response, that the boundary posts were there to protect everyone. Behind her, the team was deploying equipment with the quiet efficiency of people who had practiced this specific sequence until it was automatic and calm. Declan moving at the speed of correct, Yusuf with his steady hands running power connections, Kira calibrating the acoustic projection with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Her father stood at the ridgeline beside her, looking at the same view. He'd insisted on coming. She'd insisted he stay. They had reached the compromise of him coming, which was a diplomatic outcome neither of them had exactly wanted, but both had been prepared to accept. "Ready in 4 minutes, Declan said. 4 minutes, she confirmed. The Vethkor had studied humanity, had classified it, had designated its behavior as problematic, its territory as managed, its future as bounded. They had done this with the careful confidence of a civilization that knew, from 800 years of experience, how this kind of thing went. They had not studied Mara Voss specifically. They had not studied Harlan Voss, or Declan, or Priya, or Joachim, or Yusuf, or Kira, or Sokolov, or any of the 43 regional cells, or the 14 deployments, or the production schedule drawn up on a walk back from a dead zone by a woman who had stopped waiting. They had studied humanity as a category, as a managed variable, as something that would comply or, at worst, resist in the predictable ways that all previously managed species had resisted. They had not accounted for the specific, unreasonable, frankly irrational human habit of looking at a problem that cannot be solved and deciding that the impossibility itself was a technical detail to be engineered around. She had learned that from her father, who had learned it from fieldwork, who had developed it into a protocol, who had stayed in a Vethkor containment unit for 4 months refining it past the point where it was merely good, because good was not the same as done. "Ready," Declan said. Mara looked at the valley one more time, the scattered lights, the bounded people, the sky above them, vast and patient and indifferent in the way of physics, which does not take sides and does not care about outcomes and simply maintains the conditions under which outcomes become possible. "Switch it on," she said. The emitter came online without drama, a faint vibration through the rock under her boots, a low sustained note that the air carried more than the ears detected, already spreading down the ridgeline slope in a pattern that her father's calculations said would maintain coverage for 3 kilometers in every direction. 3 kilometers in every direction, no runners. And below the ridgeline, without knowing yet why the quality of the night had changed, 3 million people in management zones went on sleeping under a sky that was, in this small irreversible way, a different sky than the one they'd gone to sleep under. A path towards something. She picked up her pack and started down the slope. The council's planning sessions ran long and often loud. Mara attended most of them. She said less than the others expected, given that she was nominally the field authority on the scatter protocol, and therefore the person around whom every operational argument pivoted. She had learned, in the months since the dead zone crossing, that the value of saying less was not silence for its own sake, but the specific advantage of watching how other people reasoned. You learned more about a problem from listening to people disagree about it than from any single authoritative position. Her father had been trying to teach her this since she was 16, and she had finally understood it at 25, sitting in a reinforced basement while 7 exhausted, frightened, brilliant people talked themselves toward a consensus she could have stated in 3 sentences, but that would not have been believed coming from one voice, undebated. Sokolov was the best of them at the political work. He understood that conviction, however well-founded, was not the same as trust. and that trust built through process was more durable than trust built through authority. He was patient in a way Mara was not naturally patient, and she had begun to study him with the same attention she brought to terrain and runner behavior, filing the observations away. The regional leads were harder. There were 12 of them now, representing cells across 4 continents, connected by a communication system that Joachim's network team had built out of salvaged Veth core relay components that the aliens had apparently not considered worth monitoring because they had not expected humans to understand them. This was, Mara thought, a recurring theme in the Veth core's relationship with humanity. The assumption that a species could be understood by its average capability rather than by its upper tail. Every managed species, presumably, had individuals who understood things other members of their species didn't. The Veth core's ecological framework treated species as populations, as distributions, as managed variables. It did not have a good accounting for the individual who fell outside the predicted distribution and kept falling. Her father had written something about this in his sub-level 3 notes, which she'd read in full twice since the rescue. He'd framed it as a fundamental perceptual limitation in the Veth core's management philosophy. They observe populations, they are therefore surprised by persons. She'd thought about that sentence for a long time. Regional Led Ekandayo, who managed 3 cells in what had been West Africa, raised the question of escalation at the 6th council session. He was a direct man, not unkind, but with the quality of someone who had learned that directness saved lives that indirectness might cost. He asked the question everyone had been approaching obliquely for weeks and simply stated it. When they figure out what we're doing, what do they do? Adapt, Mara said. More specifically, she had thought about this carefully enough to answer without hesitation. The Veth core have 800 years of experience managing constrained species. The standard escalation response, based on what my father's records show from the other 4 worlds, is first to increase patrol density in the affected zones, which means more runners, closer spacing, less open window for our operations. If that fails to suppress the disruption, they introduce modified runners with altered signal architecture that the existing scatter protocol may not affect. If that also fails, the records describe what they call a reset response, essentially a total management zone collapse and rebuild, which historically involves significant population reduction of the constrained species. The room was quiet. The reset response was applied on the 2nd world, she continued. The constrained species there had developed a form of resistance prior to our kind of tool, more decentralized, harder to attribute, slower. The Veth core applied the reset response, and the resistance collapsed within 18 months because the population loss was too severe. She let that sit for a moment. On the 4th world, the one that drove them out, the constrained species moved faster than the escalation timeline. They didn't give the Veth core the time needed to implement modified runners or reset response logistics. The Veth core threat archives are frustratingly vague on the specific tactics the 4th world species used, but the timeline analysis is clear. The window between first effective disruption and operational withdrawal on the part of the Veth core was approximately 14 months. 14 months, Sokolov said. From the first deployment that genuinely alarmed them, not a single scatter incident but a coordinated, multi-zone disruption that demonstrated strategic intent rather than tactical opportunism, to the point where their operations were no longer sustainable. She looked around the room. We are not yet at the point of strategic demonstration. We've had 14 successful deployments. Impressive by any resistance metric. But 14 deployments across 4 months, distributed across 12 regions, reads as tactical opportunism at the management level. It's not yet the thing that makes a civilization with 800 years of experience look at its threat archives and recognize a pattern it has seen before. What does that thing look like? Ekandayo asked. Simultaneous, multi-zone, coordinated to a degree that eliminates the possibility of independent local action as an explanation. She pulled up the map she'd been building for 6 weeks on a screen that had once been a logistics display in a shipping warehouse. 43 emitter locations, 12 regional cells, patrol routes, sensor coverages, management zone perimeters, the geometry of where corridors could be cut, where populations could be reached, where the boundary posts could be, systematically and in one coordinated action rendered meaningless. 43 emitters, 12 regions, 1 window, not 14 months from now, not 6, now, before the patrol density increases, before they introduce modified runners. before the reset response gets authorized by whatever passes for their administrative hierarchy. She looked at Sokolov. "You want to trigger the recognition event," he said. Not a question. He understood immediately, as she'd expected he would. "I want to move faster than the escalation timeline," she said. "Yes." Ekandayo was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're betting our existence on a 14-month timeline. From a single historical precedent on a planet we've never visited, with a species we don't fully understand, in an operation we've never attempted at this scale." "I'm betting our existence," Mara said carefully, "on the fact that the Veth Corps left that fourth world. They have left before. They have decided before that the operational cost of maintaining a management framework exceeded whatever value the framework provided. And the only reason a species with 800 years of experience would make that decision is if the species they were trying to manage stopped behaving like something manageable." She stopped then. "We stopped being manageable a long time ago. We just haven't demonstrated it at the right scale yet." The planning took 3 weeks. Every regional lead provided patrol data, sensor coverage maps, local terrain surveys. Declan's engineering team ran power and supply calculations for a 43-emitter simultaneous deployment. Kira's acoustic team updated every emitter's projection profile for its specific terrain type. Yusuf trained 26 additional trigger operators, each session running until the timing was automatic rather than considered. Mara's father ran 3 modeling iterations on the 2 Alpha Pack variant encountered in the northern installation, incorporating data from the 9 subsequent deployments that had included Alpha Contact. By the 3rd iteration, the model's confidence interval on scatter duration for modified pack structures was narrow enough to be operationally useful. He presented it to the council with the mild satisfaction of a man who has refined a thing past the point where it is merely good. She asked him, privately, whether the fourth world species approach was documented in enough detail to tell them anything they hadn't already figured out themselves. He thought about this for a while. "The fourth world species," he said, "demonstrated one thing the records emphasize consistently. They were willing to accept that the cost of not acting was higher than the cost of acting imperfectly." He paused. "The Veth Corps described this as irrational risk tolerance. They mean it as a criticism. I'm not sure it is one. It's a species that made a calculation under pressure and committed to it," Mara said. "Yes, that's not irrational." "No," her father said. "It's specifically human." She thought about the stick figure in the drawing taped to the partition wall in Laboratory 2C. Circle sun, green hills, arms raised. Someone in Sublevel 2 had taped it there in the first years of the occupation, in a basement under a Veth Corps monitoring installation, in the middle of a situation with no obvious path to a reasonable outcome. Had put a small drawing of a person standing in a field with their arms up, not surrendering, arms up the way a person raises them at the end of a long run that turned out to be survivable. She had photographed it on the way in. She still had the image on her camera. She looked at it sometimes, in the way she looked at terrain maps and runner behavioral charts and version run, for protocol documentation, as a thing that contained information she hadn't fully extracted yet. The night of the coordinated deployment was overcast and still. 12 regions, 43 emitters, 26 trigger teams positioned at waypoints that Declan's mapping had taken 3 weeks to optimize. A comms network that Joachim's people had spent 2 weeks stress testing until the failure rate was below 1%. Every regional lead at a coordination terminal, running local assessment in parallel with the central feed. Mara was at the northern ridge, the first deployment site, the ridgeline above the valley with the 3 million people in management zones. The place where the first sustained emitter had been installed 4 months ago, and where the second and third had been added since. The corridor below had not stayed empty. People had moved through it, carefully at first, then with more confidence, then with the ordinary purposefulness of people who have forgotten, briefly and locally, that there is supposed to be a boundary here. The Veth Corps patrols had thickened in the northern zone over the past 3 weeks. Not catastrophically, not the full escalation response she'd described to the council, but enough to confirm that the management-level assessment had flagged the corridor as an anomaly. They were increasing resources to a zone that was behaving unexpectedly, which meant, exactly as she'd predicted, that the window for acting before the escalation timeline locked in was closing. 2 minutes, Declan said in her earpiece. 2 minutes, she confirmed, and passed it along the chain. The valley below was dark. and the lights in it were scattered the same way they'd been scattered 4 months ago when she'd first looked down from this ridgeline. More of them now, she thought, slightly more. People in management zones did not stop existing, even when they were told the boundaries were for their benefit. They kept doing the ordinary things, keeping lights on, cooking food, repairing structures, maintaining the physical fabric of lives that had been interrupted, and had then, with the irrational stubbornness her father identified as specifically human, resumed. She could feel the pulse in the ground. Runners on the eastern perimeter, a pack of 4 tracking a movement signature that was almost certainly one of her decoy generators cycling through its programmed pattern. They would follow it for another 20 minutes before the pattern repeated, and they recognized it as a loop. 20 minutes was enough. 1 minute, Declan said. 43 emitters across 12 regions, 12 simultaneous scatter zones. Every major management zone perimeter weakened at the same moment, for the same 90-second window, then sustained across 40 hours of continuous operation. Not a disruption, not a tactical incident, a statement, a coordinated, multi-regional, unmistakably strategic demonstration that a species described in a Veth Core threat archive as a management challenge had been spending 4 months building something it hadn't announced. 30 seconds. Her father was beside her. He didn't carry a weapon and didn't need to. His function tonight was assessment, monitoring the protocol performance across the chain, flagging anomalies in real time. He had a monitor unit in his hands and his attention was on it fully. The field ecologist reading the data landscape the way he'd always read landscapes, finding the information in it that the less practiced eye would miss. She had her hand on the Northern Ridge emitter's primary trigger, which she was operating herself tonight, and she was looking at the valley below, and she was not thinking about the Veth Core threat archives, or the 14-month timeline, or the strategic calculus of forcing a recognition event. She was thinking about a stick figure with its arms raised. She was thinking about her father's hands pressing against clear material with hers, pressing back. She was thinking about Declan at the speed of correct and Yusuf's steady hands and Kira calibrating sound the way she'd once calibrated sound for music. She was thinking about Joachim walking through a red corridor with the composure of a man who has made peace with every possible outcome, which turned out to be the most useful kind of peace. She was thinking about how her father had told her when she was 6 years old that the stars were very far away and that light from some of them had left before humans existed. She had asked him if that meant humans didn't matter, and he had said no. It meant the universe was under no obligation to make things easy, and that making things yourself was different from having them made for you, and considerably more interesting. 10 seconds, Declan said. Below the ridgeline, 3 million people slept under a sky they had been told was owned by something else. In 11 other zones across the world, people lived inside boundary posts that something else had driven into the earth. On 4 other worlds, other species had lived in those same conditions and made different choices. Compliance, extinction, survival. 5 seconds. One species, on one world, had made the choice that made a civilization with 800 years of experience leave and not come back. Their records were in a threat archive. Their designation was those who did not remain prey. She thought, "We are going to earn that designation." "Execute," Declan said. She triggered the emitter. Across 12 regions, 42 other triggers fired within a half-second window that Yusuf's training had made possible. The scatter field spread out from the northern ridge in a sustained pulse that was below hearing and above silence, that was felt in teeth and sternum and the soles of boots on cold rock, that was propagating at the speed of sound through cold air toward every runner pack within range and doing to each of them what it had done to 6 runners in a shallow drainage channel on a pale gray morning that felt very far away. 40 hours of continuous operation, 12 regions, 3 million people, and far more than 3 million across the world, in every management zone that a regional cell had reached, with a window above them, a corridor below them, a path that had not existed the day before, and that would exist now, for as long as they had the power cells to run the emitters and the will to keep running them. Mara looked at the valley. The lights were the same lights. The people behind them were the same people. But something had changed in the 40 seconds since she'd pressed a trigger on a ridgeline in the dark. Something that was not visible in the lights or the darkness, but that was real, in the way that turning points are real. The way the moment before a thing and the moment after it are the same moment, and also entirely different. The subsonic pulse in the ground was gone. The eastern perimeter runners had stopped tracking the decoy generator. She could feel the absence of their signal the way she'd learned to feel its presence, a kind of negative attention, a space where something had been that was no longer. Northern Ridge, clean, she said into the comms. 11 other voices over 30 seconds said variations of the same thing. Sokolov's voice, when it came through the channel, was measured and quiet in the way of a man who has spent a long time planning for something and is now watching it occur and is keeping himself very steady in the presence of it. All regions reporting clean, he said. Sustained operation confirmed. We're running. Her father looked up from his monitor. He looked at her. In the dark on a ridgeline, with the cold coming off the rock and the stars somewhere above the overcast and a valley full of lights below, he looked at his daughter and did not say anything. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the same gesture he'd made once. It's when she was 10 years old and had finally solved a field navigation problem she'd been struggling with for 3 days. The specific gesture that meant, "I knew you would." She put her hand over his for a moment, the same way she'd pressed her palm against the clear wall of a containment unit, the same impulse across a different distance. And then she turned back to the valley and the work. There was still a great deal of work. There always would be. But the path was open, and she was already moving, and ahead of her the scattered lights of 3 million people burned steady in the dark. Not diminished, not surrendered, not contained, just present, just there. Just burning with the ordinary, irrational, specifically human stubbornness of things that refused to go out. In the weeks that followed, the Veth Corps' response came in layers, each one a confirmation of the timeline her father's research had laid out. First, a broadcast. The standard machine translated calm of their official communications, describing the recent disruptions as a temporary technical anomaly in the management framework, assuring all managed populations that normal operational parameters would be restored shortly. The broadcast ran on every channel they still controlled, which was most of them. Mara listened to it twice and then moved on to the next deployment brief. Second layer, increased patrol density. It happened faster than she'd projected, which meant their management level assessment had moved from anomaly flagging to strategic concern within days of the coordinated deployment. Patrol routes thickened in 8 of the 12 regions. The additional runners drawn from the reserves the Veth Corps kept in holding facilities Mara's cells had been cataloging for 6 months. She had expected this. The counter-logistics were already in motion. Declan's engineering teams had pre-positioned relay nodes at the new patrol boundary edges, and Kira's acoustic division had begun the survey work for a second ring of sustained emitter positions to compensate for the density increase. Ikandayo reported a modified runner contact in his region on day 11. 2 adults with a different dorsal plate configuration, slightly altered signal architecture. The Veth Corps had begun the adaptation she'd warned the council about. His team ran the standard scatter protocol, and it worked at 70% effectiveness rather than 90. Not a failure, but a degradation. He documented it meticulously and transmitted the data to her father that afternoon. Her father spent 36 hours on the modification analysis and produced a firmware update for the scatter emitters that compensated for the altered signal architecture. He called it a patch. Mara called it exactly what it was. The beginning of an arms race that they were going to win by moving faster than the other side could adapt, because the other side was optimizing a framework designed for compliance, and they were optimizing for people who had already decided. On day 19, the first management zone perimeter in Ikandayo's region went down permanently, not disrupted temporarily by a scatter window. Actually down, the boundary post deactivated, the orbital sensor net coverage for that section dropped, the patrol presence withdrawn. The Veth Corps had made the decision that the resource cost of maintaining a specific perimeter exceeded its value and had simply stopped maintaining. It was a small withdrawal, a tactical concession in one subsection of one regional zone, not a capitulation, not a retreat, not the beginning of the 14-month drawdown. Just a cost-benefit calculation made by something with 800 years of experience, encountering a situation that did not fit its models, trimming the edges where the friction was highest. Mara read the report 3 times. Then she sent it to every regional lead with a single annotation. They are making calculations. Keep moving. Declan found her on the northern ridge at dawn on day 22, which was where she often was at dawn when she wasn't needed somewhere more specific. He had 2 cups of the thick, bitter substance that served as coffee in their supply chain and handed her one without ceremony. "The council wants to discuss negotiation," he said. "I know." Sokolov thinks the perimeter withdrawal signals that there's a threshold somewhere, a cost point where they'd prefer an arrangement to an ongoing operational drain. Sokolov is probably right. You don't sound enthusiastic. She drank her not coffee and looked at the valley. The lights were a little different now. Not more of them, but some moved in patterns that suggested people using the corridors, traveling, making the ordinary logistical choices of people who are not staying inside lines anymore. She had been watching this slow change for weeks. The way a landscape changes after rain, not dramatically but completely. Everything the same and everything different. "Negotiation is fine," she said. "Negotiation happens when both sides have decided the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of arranging something. We're not there yet." "They're not there yet." She paused. "But we're moving in the right direction. And the thing about negotiations is that the closer you are to the threshold when they start, the better the terms you get. So we keep pushing until the terms are as good as they can be. We keep pushing until the terms are what humanity actually deserves." She looked at him. "Which is not management zones and boundary posts and a framework built on the premise that we are a problem to be contained." Declan was quiet for a moment. He had the expression he wore when he was doing structural calculations in his head, testing the load-bearing capacity of a position before committing weight to it. "What does humanity actually deserve?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it. She thought about her father in a sub-level cell, refining a protocol past good because good wasn't done. She thought about Yusuf's steady hands and Kira's acoustic intuition, and Joachim's walking pace composure, and Priya's controlled breathing in the dark. She thought about 12 regional leads transmitting clean from positions that 4 months ago had been inside enemy lines. She thought about 3 million people sleeping under an open sky. She thought about a stick figure with its arms raised in a field of green hills and a round yellow sun. "The sky," she said, "the whole sky, not a piece of it." Declan considered this. Then he nodded, in the way of a structural engineer who has finished his calculation and found the load-bearing numbers sufficient. "Right," he said. "Then we keep going." Below them, the valley lights moved and burned and did not go out. The work continued, and somewhere in the Veth Corps' administrative architecture, in the threat archives that contained the records of 4 other worlds, and the designation reserved for the one species that had refused the category of prey, a new entry was being written in careful, bureaucratic language that did not know how to express what was actually happening. That a species had been assessed and contained, and had looked at the assessment and the containment and the 800 years of precedent behind it and had decided, with the specific irrational certainty of something that had run out of reasons to be reasonable, that precedent was not fate, that what had happened before was a record, not a sentence, that the boundary posts were just metal in the ground, and the ground was theirs.